The day Nellie Yates rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with a busted wagon wheel, a loaded shotgun across her lap, and absolutely no intention of asking anyone for help, was the same day Marcus Donnelly decided he was done being the kind of man other people depended on. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was the sort of town that smelled like horse sweat and ambition, where the cattle trails from Texas ended, and men with big dreams and small bank accounts came to either make their fortune or drink it away. The sun was already punishing by mid-morning, beating down on the wide dirt main street that ran between a hardware store, a feed merchant, a saloon that never seemed to close, and a small adobe building that served as both the sheriff's office and the town's only jail. The population of Caldwell hovered somewhere around 800 souls, though that number swelled considerably when the drives came through, and cowboys flooded in with their trail wages burning holes in their pockets. Nellie's wagon listed badly to the right, the rear wheel cracked clean through one of its spokes, and the whole rim was threatening to collapse entirely under the weight of everything she owned in this world, which amounted to 4 crates of medical supplies, a portable surgical kit she had carried all the way from Philadelphia, a change of dresses, a bedroll, a water canteen, and a small tin box containing every letter her late father had ever written her. She guided her gray mare, Duchess, with a firm and practiced hand, keeping the wagon moving slowly enough that the broken wheel did not give out entirely before she reached something that resembled civilization. She was 26 years old, with dark red hair she kept braided down her back, gray eyes sharp enough to notice things most people missed, and hands that were already rougher than they should have been for someone who had grown up with a physician father in a comfortable Philadelphia townhouse. She had a slight dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose that she had spent years trying to hate and eventually decided to accept, and she carried herself with the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, until they got close enough to realize it was actually competence. She had left Philadelphia 18 months earlier, after her father had died and left her his medical bag, his surgical notes, and the deeply inconvenient certainty that the work he had devoted his life to was the same work she wanted to do: medicine, healing. The kind of work that Philadelphia's medical establishment had made abundantly clear was not meant for women, no matter how many hours she had spent learning at her father's elbow, no matter how well she understood anatomy, no matter how steady her hands were when everything was falling apart around her. So she had gone west, because the West, by all accounts, had a desperate shortage of doctors and a considerably more flexible definition of who was qualified to provide medical care. She had stopped in 3 towns already. The first had already hired a doctor who did not want competition. The second had been hostile in ways that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the fact that she had arrived alone. The third had been burned out 2 weeks before she arrived, casualties of a conflict between 2 competing cattle operations that nobody in the territory seemed to be in a hurry to resolve. She had kept moving. Marcus Donnelly was sitting on the front steps of the livery stable when Nellie's wagon came creaking down the main street of Caldwell, and he watched it with the quiet, assessing attention of a man who had spent 15 years working with animals and machinery, and had learned to read the sound of something about to break. He was 31, lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that were patient in the way of someone who had learned that patience was more useful than anger. He had a scar along his jawline from a cattle incident. He did not enjoy explaining. 3 days of beard because he had not found a reason to shave, and the kind of worn, comfortable clothes that suggested he cared more about being useful than being impressive. He had come to Caldwell 6 months ago with a small sum of money saved from nearly a decade of working cattle drives for the Kishom and Western Trail operations, with the intention of buying into the livery stable partnership that his old trail boss, A man named Chet Brannigan had offered him. Chet was 58 and his knees had finally told him they were done with cattle, so he had settled in Caldwell, bought the livery, and written Marcus a letter explaining that if Marcus brought his savings and his back, they could build something worth owning. Marcus had come. Chet had been dead of a sudden fever by the time Marcus arrived, leaving behind a wife who had already decided to go back to Missouri, and a livery stable that Marcus now owned outright, because Chet had written a will during his illness that nobody had expected him to need so soon. Marcus had not planned on owning a business at 31. He had not planned on a lot of things. But the horses were good, and the work was honest, and Caldwell was as good a place as any to figure out what came next. He watched the wagon's rear wheel wobble and heard the particular grinding sound of a cracked spoke under load, and he stood up from the steps without making any great event of it and walked out into the street to where the wagon had stopped, because the mare had stopped, and horses generally knew when things were bad enough to require stillness. "Your rear wheel is about 2 minutes from giving out entirely," he said, looking at the wheel rather than at the woman holding the reins, which was the kind of thing he did automatically, because it was the wheel that needed addressing. Nellie looked down at him from the wagon seat. She had already assessed the wheel herself approximately 40 minutes ago and had spent the intervening time calculating exactly how much further she could push it. She had concluded 2 minutes was a reasonable estimate, though she had been hoping for 5. "I know," she said. He looked up at her then because the answer had been flat and certain rather than flustered, which was not what he had expected. "You have supplies in there. Medical supplies, yes," he processed that. "You are the doctor the county put out the notice for." "I am a physician, yes," she said, and there was the faintest edge in her voice on the word physician, the kind of edge that suggested she had said it in the face of skepticism enough times that it had become a practiced firmness. "I answered their notice. I intend to set up a practice here." Marcus looked at the wheel again, then back at her. "Pull it around to the stable." "I will have it fixed before the day is out." Nellie looked at the livery stable, then back at him. "What is the rate?" he told her. She considered it. It was fair. She had been quoted twice that in the last town. "All right," she said. That was how it began. Not with drama, not with a lightning bolt of attraction, not with anything that either of them would have called remarkable. Just a broken wheel and 2 people being practical about it. Nellie climbed down from the wagon herself before he offered to help, which he had not yet done, so there was no awkwardness about it. She went around to the back, lifted the canvas flap to check that nothing had shifted, satisfied herself that the crates were secure, and then tied Duchess's lead rope to the hitching post outside the stable, while Marcus got underneath the wagon to look properly at the damage. "2 spokes cracked and the rim is bent," he said, from somewhere under the wagon. "I can have it done by evening. The mare could use water and feed." "She could," Nellie agreed. "What does that run?" He named a price for the day's board. She agreed without haggling, which told him she was tired and probably running on a short tolerance for additional problems. She took her medical bag from the wagon and walked down the street to find the sheriff, because that had been her plan from the beginning, to announce herself to whoever held official authority in Caldwell and establish, from the first moment, that she was there to practice medicine, and that she intended to be taken seriously. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Holt with a gray mustache, and an expression that suggested he had seen enough strange things that one more barely registered, looked her over, asked to see her credentials, studied the letters from the Pennsylvania Medical Society and her father's endorsements with more care than she had expected, and then told her that the town had been without a physician for 8 months, and that there were people who genuinely needed care. "The old doctor's office is on the corner of 2nd and Market," Sheriff Holt said. "Widow Pierce owns the building. She has been renting the front room as storage since Doc Emmers left. She is a reasonable woman. Tell her I sent you." Nellie thanked him, which she did sincerely rather than automatically, and went to find Widow Pierce. Widow Pierce was 62, small and direct, with white hair and the look of someone who had weathered considerable difficulty and emerged from it with her opinions intact. She listened to Nellie's proposal with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly, and then she asked two questions: whether Nellie could pay the first month's rent in advance, and whether she was planning to run off as soon as something better came along. Nellie said yes to the first and no to the second. "Then we have an arrangement," Widow Pierce said. The room was dusty and needed work, but it had good light from two large windows, enough space for an examination area and a small waiting room, and a back room that could be used for more serious procedures. Nellie spent the rest of that afternoon unpacking what she could carry herself and making mental notes of what she would need. When she went back to the livery stable at evening to collect her wagon and Duchess, the wheel had been repaired cleanly, and someone had also oiled the axle, which she had not asked for and which had needed doing for at least 2 weeks. Marcus was brushing a bay horse in the far stall when she came in, and he walked over to show her the repair. He explained what had been cracked, what he had replaced, and what he had reinforced, all in the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to explain the weather. "You did not have to oil the axle," she said. "It was making a sound," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking for a thank you in any particular form, that much was clear. He had done it because it needed doing, and that was the end of his interest in the matter as far as she could tell. She paid what she owed him, noted that he charged her exactly the agreed amount and nothing added for the axle work, and drove her wagon back down to the office on 2nd and Market. She thought about that a little as she unloaded her crates in the gathering dusk. The first week in Caldwell was relentless. Word traveled fast in a town that size, and by the second day, people were appearing at her door. A child with a deep cut from a fence post who needed stitching. A ranch hand with a broken finger set badly. A woman named Clara Bowen, who had been managing a persistent cough with whiskey and hope, and who turned out to have a treatable respiratory infection if Nellie could get the right materials. An older man with a tooth so infected it had begun to affect his jaw. Nellie worked from early morning until late at night. She sent a list of supplies to the freight merchant with a carefully composed letter to a medical supply company in Kansas City, calculating shipping times and prioritizing what she needed most urgently. She established a rate schedule that was honest about what she needed to sustain the practice and flexible enough to account for the fact that not everyone who needed care had money to pay for it. She ate her meals quickly and slept deeply and woke with the intention of doing more than the day before. She saw Marcus Donnelly 3 times that first week. Once when she took Duchess to the stable for a reshoe, once when they passed each other on the main street and both nodded without stopping, and once at the general store where she was buying soap and he was collecting a supply order, and they ended up standing at the same counter waiting for the same man to finish writing in his ledger. "How is the practice coming?" he asked, not in the way people asked when they were being polite, but in the way people asked when they had a passing genuine interest. "Better than expected," she said. "There is a great deal of need." "There is," he agreed. Doc Emmers was decent enough, but he liked his bottle, and toward the end people had stopped trusting him. She thought about that. "That is useful to know," he nodded. The storekeeper finished his ledger work and attended to them, and they went their separate ways. She thought about him in the margins of other thoughts, which was unusual for her because she did not generally have much margin space. There was something about the economy of the way he operated, the absence of performance in everything he did, that she found herself noticing. Most men she had encountered in the West fell into one of 2 categories: the ones who were immediately suspicious of her, and the ones who were immediately and excessively helpful in ways that communicated that they did not believe she could manage without them. Marcus Donnelly appeared to fall into neither category. He seemed to simply note her existence as a fact and respond to specific circumstances as they arose, which was so rare it was almost disorienting. She told herself it was just that she was tired and looking for easy things. The thing that shifted the margins happened on a Tuesday evening in late April. Nellie had just finished a long procedure, setting and splinting a badly broken arm on a 12-year-old boy named Thomas who had fallen from a hay loft, and she was standing outside her office in the cooling air, her sleeves still rolled up, trying to let the tension of the last 2 hours drain out of her shoulders, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the saloon. She did not go to investigate because raised voices outside saloons were among the most common sounds in Caldwell after sunset, and she had learned quickly to distinguish the sounds of ordinary trouble from the sounds of extraordinary trouble. This sounded ordinary. Then it sounded less ordinary. Then there was the kind of silence that sometimes preceded something worse, and then a single sharp sound that was not quite a gunshot but could have been something thrown hard against something hollow. She was already picking up her medical bag when a boy she recognized as the saloon owner's son came running down the street. "Miss Yates," he called, which was technically incorrect, but she had stopped correcting it after the first day. "There is a man hurt." She followed him at a brisk walk that was almost a run. The man hurt was a trail cowboy, not local, who had gotten into a disagreement about a card game and had the considerable misfortune of being stabbed with a folding knife in the side before anyone with sense had been able to stop it. He was sitting in a chair outside the saloon, holding his side, with the look of a man who was more frightened than he was trying to appear. Nellie assessed the wound, determined it had not penetrated anything immediately fatal, but was deep enough to require thorough cleaning and careful closure, and told the men standing around to bring more light and hot water. Marcus was there. She did not know when he had arrived, but when she looked up to repeat her request for hot water, he was the one who had already moved toward the saloon to get it without waiting to be asked twice. He came back with a clean basin and the lamp from the saloon table, positioned it where it was most useful, and then stood back out of her way without being told. She worked. The cowboy hissed and swore. She told him flatly to hold still and that it was going to hurt, and that it would hurt less if he cooperated. He cooperated in the end. She stitched the wound with the particular steady concentration she brought to everything requiring precision, and when she was done, she gave him clear instructions about cleaning it and watching for infection, and told the saloon owner that the man needed somewhere to sleep that night, and that he should not ride for at least 3 days. When she stood up and gathered her tools, the small crowd that had gathered was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had learned to read. Not suspicion exactly, but reassessment, people updating their understanding of what she was. She was cleaning her instruments when Marcus appeared at her elbow with a cup of water, not the kind of grand gesture that announced itself, just a quiet appearance with water that she had not asked for and very much needed. She drank it without comment, nodded at him, and finished her work. "That was steady," he said. "It needed to be steady," she said. "So it was." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. There was a movement around the corner of his mouth that suggested he found this answer satisfactory in some way. He went back to wherever he had come from, and she walked back to her office to re-sterilize her equipment and write up her notes on the case. She thought about the cup of water for longer than was strictly necessary. The following week, Nellie got into a disagreement with a man named Garfield Potts, who ran one of the larger cattle supply operations north of town, and who had apparently decided that the town physician ought to be available at his personal convenience, and not at the hours she had posted on her door. He appeared at her office at 6 in the morning, before her posted hours began, and when she explained this, he told her that he was an important man in Caldwell, and that she ought to understand where her support came from. Nellie explained, in terms that were polite but entirely unambiguous, that her support came from providing good medical care to the people who needed it, that her hours were posted because she kept them, and that if he had a genuine medical concern, he was welcome to return at 8 o'clock when she opened. Potts left in a state of profound irritation, and Nellie went back to finishing her morning preparation, aware that she had probably made an enemy of someone who was accustomed to being catered to, and that this would have some consequence she could not yet fully predict. The consequence arrived 2 days later in the form of a conversation she overheard at the general store, between Potts and two other men she did not know, in which Potts was suggesting that a woman practicing medicine alone in a western town was an invitation to all manner of impropriety, and that someone with good standing in the community ought to raise the concern with Sheriff Holt. Nellie bought her soap and her lamp oil, thanked the storekeeper, and left without addressing what she had heard, because she had learned that addressing things of this type directly in public gave them oxygen they did not deserve. She went instead to Sheriff Holt herself that same afternoon and told him plainly what she had heard and what she expected Potts to do about it. Sheriff Holt listened, scratched his mustache, and said, "Garfield Potts has been trying to run things in this town his way since 1873, and mostly people let him because it is easier. But I have the county's letter authorizing your practice, and I have seen your credentials, and there is nothing improper about a physician operating legitimate hours and a legitimate business. If he comes to me with complaints, I will tell him so." "Thank you," Nellie said, and meant it. She told no one about the episode except, for reasons she was still examining when she went to bed that night, Widow Pierce, who listened, clicked her tongue with controlled anger and said, "Garfield Potts has been an obstacle to the progress of this town for longer than you have been alive, my dear. Pay him the minimum attention required and not one moment more." Nellie decided she very much liked Widow Pierce. She was still examining the reason she had also wanted to tell Marcus Donnelly about it, though she could not quite articulate why. She had not seen him since the saloon incident, not in any meaningful way. She had passed the livery stable twice, once when he was inside with a horse and did not see her, once when he was on the steps talking to another man and looked up and raised 2 fingers in a brief acknowledging gesture that she returned. It was ridiculous to think about a near stranger in the context of wanting to tell him something. She had been alone in her own company for a long time, which was something she had chosen and which she did not regret, but which had the occasional side effect of making her notice, with more clarity than was always comfortable, when she encountered someone she thought she might actually like talking to. She picked up her father's medical notes and read for an hour until her mind settled. The conversation happened because of a horse. One of Nellie's patients in early May was an old Comanche man named Ho, who lived on the edge of town and whom she had treated twice for a respiratory condition. He came on a morning when she was walking past the livery stable, and he was leading a horse that was limping very badly on its right foreleg. And when he saw her, he stopped and looked at the horse, and then at her with an expression that communicated something had gone wrong, and he was not sure where to take it. Nellie was a physician, not a veterinarian, but she crouched down by the horse's foreleg because she understood the basics of injury, and the horse was in evident pain. It had a deep cut on the fetlock area, probably from wire, and it had been walking on it long enough that the surrounding area was swollen and hot. "This needs proper attention," she said, looking up at Ho. "The livery man knows horses better than I do." Marcus was inside and heard the exchange and came out. He crouched by the horse, assessed the wound with the same unhurried focus he brought to everything, and said to Ho, quietly and with respect, that he could clean and pack the wound if Ho wanted. Ho watched Marcus for a moment with the calculating assessment of a man who had learned the hard way which people meant what they said and which did not, and then he nodded. Nellie stayed, partly because she was curious and partly because she had no appointments for the next hour, and she liked watching competent people work. Marcus treated the horse's wound with a sureness that she recognized from her own work, cleaning it thoroughly, packing it, and showing Ho what he needed to watch for and what to do over the coming days. When it was done, Ho looked between the two of them and said something in his own language that Marcus did not understand but Nellie suspected was some form of acknowledgement because it had that quality. Ho led his horse away slowly, and Nellie and Marcus were left standing outside the stable in the warm May morning. "You know horse medicine," she said. 15 years on the trails will do that, he said. "You know enough to recognize when you are out of your expertise." "I had a good teacher," she said. She meant her father. Marcus probably assumed she meant a medical school, and she did not correct it. "Where did you train?" he asked, not in a challenging way, just in the way of someone genuinely curious. She told him the truth, that she had trained primarily under her father, who had been a physician for 30 years in Philadelphia, and had taught her everything he knew starting from when she was 12 years old. That she had taken formal examination and received certification through the Pennsylvania Medical Society, which had not been easy to obtain as a woman but which she had obtained. That she had additional study in surgical techniques from correspondence with doctors at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which had been operating for nearly 30 years, and which trained women physicians as seriously as any institution in the country. He listened without the expression she was accustomed to, the expression that went across certain men's faces when she listed her credentials, the expression that suggested they were keeping score against some internal measure of acceptable female accomplishment. He just listened, with the straightforward interest of someone gathering information. "You left Philadelphia," he said. "The whole established practice of it." "There was no practice for me to establish there," she said. "Not the kind I wanted." He nodded once slowly in a way that suggested he understood something about leaving an impossible situation for a possible one, even if the possible one was harder. "How long were you on the drives?" she asked. "First one at 17, he said. "Last one 18 months ago. What made you stop?" He thought about this for a moment, not in the evasive way of someone who did not want to answer, but in the genuine way of someone who had not been asked recently and was taking the question seriously. "I got tired of moving," he said, finally. "The work is good. The moving is not. 15 years of arriving somewhere and leaving before it became a place I knew." Nellie understood this more precisely than she would have expected. "That is why you stayed here," she said. "That is why I stayed here," he confirmed. They stood in the morning light for another moment, and then she said she needed to get back to the office, and he said he had a delivery coming, and they went their separate ways. But the quality of the parting was different from the previous ones, warmer in some way that she noticed without knowing entirely what to do with. Nellie was not looking for a hero. This was something she had worked out with considerable clarity over the last 18 months of her life. She had grown up watching women of her mother's generation, and her own generation attached themselves to the idea of being rescued, of having someone large and capable appear, and make the difficult things easier. And she had seen how often that idea curdled into something else, into dependence, into the loss of the particular competence that came from having to manage things yourself. Her father had not raised her to be rescued. He had raised her to be useful, to be capable, to be the person who showed up when things were hard rather than the person who waited for someone else to show up. She had also, more recently and more privately, come to understand that she had been burned once by something that had looked like partnership and turned out to be management. A man in Philadelphia named Robert, educated and attentive, and ultimately convinced that his vision of what her life should be was more important than her own. He had presented it as care. He had offered to fund a small practice, just the kind of gentle, appropriate medicine that women were meant to practice. Childbirth, children's ailments, the soft margins of the medical world. When she had told him that she wanted more than the soft margins, he had looked at her with an expression of such sincere bafflement that she understood he had never truly listened to anything she had said about her ambitions. She had ended it. He had been bewildered and then angry. She had left Philadelphia 3 months later. She did not want someone to fix things for her. She did not want someone who needed to be the strong one, the capable one, the one holding the world together on her behalf. She was already holding her own world together very well, thank you, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. The trouble with Marcus Donnelly, as she was increasingly forced to acknowledge to herself through the warm weeks of May, was that he did not appear to be the slightest bit interested in being anyone's hero. He fixed things because they needed fixing. He offered help in the precise amount that was useful, and then stepped back. He listened when she talked and spoke when he had something worth saying. He did not look at her practice with the assessing air of someone calculating whether it was respectable enough. He looked at it the way he looked at his livery stable, as work being done by someone who knew their work. She ran into him at the church social in mid-May, which she had attended primarily because Widow Pierce had told her it was the best way to meet the families she would be treating, and that showing up mattered in a town this size. Marcus was there because apparently Chet Brannigan had been a church-going man, and the congregation still viewed Marcus as part of that legacy. He was talking to a rancher named Silas Webb when she arrived, and when he saw her come in, he did not do the thing men sometimes did at social events, which was use eye contact as a kind of territorial claim. He just nodded the same way he always nodded, the two-fingered acknowledgement that she had come to find oddly comforting in its consistency, and returned to his conversation. She made her rounds, talked to 3 families whose children she had treated, discussed the ongoing supply situation with the freight merchant who had become one of her early allies, and ate a plate of food standing up because that was the fastest way to eat when she had a lot of people to speak to. At some point in the evening she found herself standing with a glass of lemonade near the edge of the gathering, and Marcus materialized beside her with his own glass, and they both looked at the room for a moment before either of them said anything. "How are you finding Caldwell?" he asked. "I am finding it honest," she said. "The needs are real and the people mostly are direct about them." "Mostly. There is Garfield Potts," she said. He made a sound that was more eloquent than many full sentences she had heard about Garfield Potts. "He has been that way since I arrived," he said. "He tried to buy the livery from me the first week I owned it. When I said no, he started sending people to the other stable in the next county. Did it hurt your business? For a while. Then the drives came through and there was more business than I could handle alone and people stopped listening to him about it. He will run out of levers eventually," Nellie said. "He usually does," Marcus said, "and then he finds new ones." "Well," she said, "I have been managing obstacles since before I arrived in Kansas. He will not be the last one." He looked at her then, with a directness that was different from the usual passing assessment. A longer, quieter look that had something in it she could not quite name. Not desire, not yet, though she had been aware for weeks that there was a physical reality to him that she was not entirely ignoring, something more like recognition, the look a person gave someone when they understood something new and important about them. "You are not what I expected when they said a woman doctor was coming," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" He considered this honestly. "Someone who needed the town to believe in her," he said. "I need the town to let me work," she said. "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "it is not." They stood quietly for a moment, and then the fiddler in the corner started up again, and conversation became more difficult, and they drifted apart naturally. But there was something that stayed in the air between them, or more precisely, stayed with Nellie as she walked home that night under a sky full of stars that Kansas seemed to produce in embarrassing quantity. She had not come to Caldwell looking for a man. She had come to Caldwell to practice medicine. Those were 2 entirely separate things, and she had no intention of conflating them. She lay awake for a while anyway. It was a Thursday afternoon in early June when Marcus Donnelly said something that shifted everything. Nellie was coming out of her office after a morning of appointments that had included a genuine obstetric emergency, a difficult birth that had required hours of careful work, and had ultimately ended with both mother and child alive, which was not a certainty she had been able to guarantee at the beginning. She was exhausted in the particular deep way that came from spending hours holding someone else's worst moment together through force of skill and will, and she was walking to the general store because she needed to eat something, and she had run out of the crackers she kept in her desk. Marcus was across the street, and he looked at her as she came out, and something in her face must have told him it had been a long morning, because he crossed the street and fell into step beside her without being asked. "Difficult morning," he said. "Clara Bowen's baby came early and complicated," she said. "They are both alive." He did not say what a lot of people would have said, which was some version of "you must feel wonderful, or are you not proud of yourself?" He said, "Good," and then he said, "Have you eaten?" She had not eaten since before 6 that morning. She told him so. "There is good stew at the boarding house on Wednesdays and Thursdays," he said. "Mrs. Carmichael makes more than her boarders can finish and sells the rest." They ate at Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house, at the small table near the window, with the good stew and bread that was nearly as good as anything Nellie had eaten since Philadelphia, and they talked in the way that people talk when the guard has come down a little, because one of them is too tired to keep it fully up. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, a father who had worked river transport until a flood had taken the boat and everything with it, after which they had moved west because west was where people went when the thing they had been relying on stopped working. He had been 12. His oldest brother had gone to work cattle because a man could do that without capital, and Marcus had followed at 17, and by then it had been the only life he knew how to do well. She told him about her father, about the way he had brought her to the hospital where he worked when she was 9 years old, and she had been terrified and fascinated in equal measure, about the first time she had watched him stitch a wound, and understood that this was something a person could learn to do with their hands, that it was not magic, but it was as close as human beings came to magic. She told him that he had died of a heart event that had been quick, which she was grateful for, and that she had been holding his hand, which she was also grateful for. Marcus listened to all of this without trying to make it smaller or larger than it was. When she talked about her father, he listened the way a person listened when they understood loss. He had lost Chet Brannigan, she knew, though she had not thought of it in those terms before. A man who had been a mentor who had died before Marcus arrived, leaving behind something that was both a gift and a grief. "What made you decide to stay after he died?" she asked. "You could have sold the stable and moved on." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "I asked myself the same question," he said. "I think it was that I had spent 15 years not staying anywhere, and the fact that there was no one waiting for me to leave made it easier to try staying." Something about this struck her very directly. The honesty of it, the absence of performance. "I understand that," she said. She did not elaborate, but she thought she saw in his expression that he understood she was not just agreeing to be agreeable. After that, they fell into the kind of easy, irregular company that Nellie would not have known how to describe and did not try to. He would stop by her office with no reason some mornings when he was passing and say 2 sentences about something he had noticed. She would sometimes walk by the stable in the evening on her way back from a late call, and they would talk for 10 minutes in the open doorway. At the general store, if they arrived at the same time, they did their business together and walked part of the way back toward their respective places on the same street. She knew, in the clear-eyed way she knew most things, that there was something between them that was building itself without any deliberate architecture, and that it was the kind of something that would eventually require acknowledgement. She also knew, because she had examined it carefully, that whatever it was not the thing she had run from in Philadelphia. There was no management in it, no performance of rescue, no hovering quality of someone waiting to be needed. He simply existed in the same town as she did his work, and found her interesting. She found him interesting. These were facts, and she was a person who dealt with facts. In late June, Garfield Potts made his second move. He had apparently decided that direct complaints to Sheriff Holt were not going to work, so he had instead begun a quieter campaign, speaking to people who owed him money or favors, and suggesting that they might be better served by the doctor he was personally planning to invite to Caldwell from Wichita, A real doctor. A phrase that Nellie heard about from 3 separate people within a week. She was genuinely, if briefly, furious about it. The precise fury of someone who had built something through merit and hard work being undermined by someone with money, and the willingness to use it as a lever against people who could not afford to say no. She was walking with this fury down the main street on a Friday afternoon when she encountered Marcus, who was coming in the opposite direction, and he took one look at her face and said, "What has happened?" she told him, concisely and without melodrama. He listened, and then he said something that surprised her. "I will talk to Webb and the Carver brothers," he said, naming 3 ranchers she knew had significant influence in Caldwell. "Not because you cannot manage Potts yourself, but because there are things I know about how Potts operates from before you arrived here, and those things may be useful to you." She stopped walking. "You are not offering to fix it." "No," he said. "I am offering information that is mine to give. What you do with it is yours." She looked at him for a moment, this man who understood the difference so precisely. "Tell me," she said. What he knew was this: Potts had run the previous doctor out of town, not by complaints of incompetence but by the specific tactic of withholding trade from any business that referred patients to the doctor, essentially economically starving the practice until the doctor left. Potts controlled enough of the supply chain in Caldwell that he had leverage over the merchant class, and he had used it before. Armed with this information, Nellie went to the 3 largest ranchers in the area herself, not to ask for protection but to offer them clarity. If Potts succeeded in removing her from Caldwell, the next doctor he invited would be a doctor who served his interests, and if any of those ranchers' families needed medical care in the meantime, they would need to ride to Wichita, which was a long ride with an injured child or a sick wife. All 3 ranchers were reasonable men. All 3 had families. All 3 had used Nellie's services or seen the results of her work. Silas Webb, who had the most standing in the area, went to Potts directly and told him that disrupting the town's medical care was not something the ranching community was prepared to support. Potts backed down. Not completely, not warmly, but the active campaign stopped, and Nellie understood that it would likely remain stopped as long as the economic reality made it more trouble than it was worth. She told Marcus what had happened when she saw him next, and he looked satisfied in the way of someone who had supplied the right tool for the right job. "You did that yourself," he said, "with information you gave me." "Information is different from doing," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is. Thank you for knowing the difference." He looked at her with that quiet, direct look he had, and something in the air between them was different again, more deliberate, like something that had been circling patiently had finally decided on its direction. It was a Sunday in mid-July when they had the conversation that had been building since the first broken wheel in April. They had taken to occasionally walking in the evenings, which was something that had begun simply because they had both been walking in the same direction, and had continued because neither of them had suggested stopping. They walked to the edge of town where the grassland began, and in July the grass was tall and the sky went on forever and the air was warm but not the punishing heat of midday. "Can I ask you something?" he said, which was not actually a question. It was an announcement that a question was coming. "Yes," she said. "Are you staying in Caldwell?" She had not expected that particular question. She had expected if they were going to have any kind of clarifying conversation, something more interpersonal. This was in some ways more fundamental. "Yes," she said after a moment, "I am staying. I have a practice, I have patients who depend on me, I have leased the office through the end of next year. Yes, I am staying. I am asking because I would like to know if you are someone I am going to know for a long time," he said, with the same directness he brought to everything, no ceremony, no build-up, just the statement of the thing. Nellie was quiet for a moment, looking at the grass and the fading sky. "And if I am," she said, "then I would like to stop being careful about it," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the grass the way he usually looked at things he was being honest about, which was straight at them. "What does that mean, exactly?" He looked at her then. It means I think about you more than I should given that we have mostly talked about broken wheels and horse medicine, he said, and I would like to stop pretending that is not true. Nellie's heart did something that she would have found embarrassing if she had not been 30 miles ahead of it in her own head, already aware this was coming, already aware that her own feelings had been accumulating for months with the patient efficiency of a woman who dealt in facts. I think about you too, she said, more than the circumstances warrant. I know, he said. She laughed, which was something she did not do often and which seemed to surprise him. You know. You have been different around me for 2 months, he said. Not different bad, just different. You have been different around me too, she said. I know that as well, he said. They were quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty, and then she said, I should tell you something. Tell me, he said. She told him about Robert. Not all of it, just the relevant parts. That she had been in something she had thought was a partnership and had turned out not to be, and that the experience had made her careful about what she let into the space around her practice and her work, because what she did was not separate from who she was, and she was not willing to trade one for the other. He listened to all of it without a word, and when she was done, he said, I am not going to ask you to be anything other than what you are, Nellie. The use of her first name, which he had not used before, landed with a quiet significance. She had been Miss Yates for months. I know, she said, and realized she did know it, that it was one of the things she had been observing since April with her characteristic clinical precision, the way he looked at her practice with respect rather than tolerance, the way he responded to her competence with interest rather than discomfort. I am also not looking to be needed for anything in particular, he said, just to be present. She looked at him in the long light of the July evening, this man who had come to Caldwell because he was done moving, who had lost his mentor before he arrived, who had built something patient and honest out of what remained, who had not once in 4 months tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. That is a remarkably good answer, she said. I have been thinking about what to say since April, he said. She took his hand, which was the first physical thing she had done, a deliberate choice by a deliberate person. His hand was warm and still, and then his fingers closed around hers with a gentle certainty that she felt in a place she had kept very well guarded for a very long time. They walked back to town holding hands in the summer dusk, and Caldwell went about its evening business around them, and Nellie thought that this was, without question, the best thing that had happened since the broken wheel, and that she was not remotely surprised. What followed was the courtship of two people who were already, in most of the practical senses, well acquainted. It was not dramatic. It was the accumulation of Sunday evenings and shared meals and conversations that went on past the point of having any particular subject and became conversations about being alive and what they thought about it. He brought her coffee on mornings when she had early appointments and left it on the step of her office without ceremony, and she brought him books she had finished, because she had noticed he read when he had quiet evenings, and they went to the church social in August together, deliberately this time, and the town absorbed this new reality with the collective nod of people who had seen it coming. Widow Pierce told Nellie privately that she was glad, which was the closest the old woman came to enthusiasm. Sheriff Holt nodded when he saw them walking together one morning, his mustache arranged in something that might have been a smile. Silas Webb mentioned to his wife that the doctor and the livery man seemed well suited, which his wife apparently already knew because she had mentioned it to 3 people in July. Garfield Potts said nothing, because he had no lever here and he knew it. In August, there was a genuine crisis. A fire broke out at the feed warehouse on the east end of town, caused by a lantern knocked over during a night shift. It spread fast because summer had been dry, and the warehouse was full of material that burned eagerly. 3 men were injured getting the animals out of the adjacent holding pens, one of them with significant burns on his arms and hands, one with a broken leg from a fall in the chaos, and one with smoke inhalation severe enough to be dangerous. Nellie ran to the scene with her bag and worked in the open air in the light of the fire and the lanterns that people had brought, with the focused economy of someone who had been trained for exactly this, who knew the order in which things had to be addressed and addressed them in that order. She called for water, for clean cloth, for people to hold things and hold still and do specific things at specific times, and people did them because her voice carried exactly the kind of authority that removed the option of doing otherwise. Marcus was there because he had run to help get the horses from the adjacent stable to safety, which he had managed efficiently and without casualties. When the horses were secured, he came to where Nellie was working and, without asking, positioned himself as the person who handed her what she needed and held what needed to be held and sent people for more supplies when she said the word. They did not speak much during the crisis itself. They did not need to. He understood what she needed from watching her work, and she trusted that whatever she asked for would appear without delay, and it did. The man with the burns was the most serious case, and she worked on him for nearly an hour, cooling the burns, treating them with everything she had that was appropriate, giving him the clearest picture she could of what he faced and what his odds were if he followed her instructions precisely. When it was over and the fire was out and the injured men were settled, and the town was doing the collective exhale of a crisis managed, Nellie sat down on a crate outside the destroyed warehouse and let herself be still for a moment. Marcus sat down beside her. He did not say that she had been remarkable, though she had been. He did not say anything at all for a moment, just sat with the same solid presence she had come to rely on without ever having asked for it. Then he said, "The man with the burns, what are his chances?" "Good if the infection stays out," she said. "I will see him twice a day for the next week. If it stays clean, he has a real chance at full function." "All right," he said. "That is good." "It is good," she agreed. He took her hand the way she had taken his that first time, gently certain, and they sat outside the ruined warehouse in the late August night while the town settled around them. And Nellie thought that there was something very precise about this, about sitting in the middle of the aftermath of something hard with someone who was not performing strength for her benefit, just sitting, just being in it with her, and that this was more valuable than anything she had ever been offered in Philadelphia. The man with the burns was named Arlo Fitch, and he was 34 and had 3 children and a wife named Dora who sat with him every day that first week. Nellie visited twice daily as she had promised, cleaning and treating and checking for the signs of infection that would tell her the case was turning bad. On the 5th day, the wounds looked better than she had expected, and by the end of the 2nd week, she was cautiously confident. Arlo Fitch was going to keep his hands. Dora Fitch cried when Nellie told her. Nellie accepted this without discomfort because she understood why. She had simply done her job, but sometimes a job done well was the most important thing there was. She told Marcus about it that evening, and he listened with his whole attention and said, "You should be proud of that," with a simplicity that she knew he meant entirely, and that landed cleanly without the excess sentiment that would have made her deflect it. "I am," she said. "I am very proud of it." September brought a change in the quality of the light, the grasslands going golden, the heat backing off into something more manageable, and a clarity in the air that made everything look sharp and close. Nellie loved it with a fierceness that surprised her, this landscape she had not grown up in, this sky that was bigger than any sky she had known before. She had been in Caldwell 6 months, and it was hers now, she had decided. Hers in the way that a place became yours not by accident of birth, but by the choice to stay and the work of putting down roots. She and Marcus spent a Sunday afternoon in late September riding out past the edge of town, Duchess for her, and a steady chestnut named George that Marcus preferred, into the long flat openness of the Kansas plains, where the grass moved like water in the wind, and the horizon went so far that you could feel the curve of the earth under it all. They rode without talking much, the way people who were comfortable together could ride, and stopped at a creek where the cottonwoods were beginning to turn, and ate the food they had brought and sat on the bank with their feet near the water. "I want to ask you something," Nellie said. "Ask," he said. "What do you want from this, from the rest of it?" He was quiet in the way she had learned meant he was taking the question seriously. "I want what I have," he said. "The work that is mine, the town I know. I want you to be part of that if you want to be." "How much of a part?" she asked, because she was not going to dance around it when she could simply say it. He looked at her with the full, direct gaze he had, the one she had stopped bracing against and started looking forward to. "I want to marry you, Nellie," he said, without preamble, without theater. "Not now if you are not ready, but that is where I am pointing." She had known. She had known in the way she knew most things before they were spoken, by observing the evidence. She had also spent several weeks deciding what she wanted to say about it when it came. "I will marry you," she said. "On the condition that we are clear about one thing." "Tell me the condition," he said. "My practice is mine," she said. "My work is mine. I will be your wife, and I will want to be, but I will not be a wife who is a wife first and everything else after. I have to be both at the same time." "I know that," he said. "It would not be you otherwise, and it is you I am asking to marry." She looked at him for a moment, this endlessly sensible man who said the right thing because he meant it, and not because he had calculated that it was right. "Then yes," she said. "That is my answer, yes." He smiled then, fully, which was rare enough that she had catalogued his smiles and found them valuable. It changed his whole face, made him look younger and warmer, and something that she could only describe as entirely himself. She smiled back, which she knew looked different on her than it looked on women who smiled frequently, which made it, she thought, more rather than less. He kissed her in the cottonwood shade by the creek, which was the first time, and it was exactly as unhurried and certain as everything else he did, and she held the front of his shirt and thought that this was a remarkably uncomplicated thing for something she had expected to be complicated. They were married in Caldwell in October of 1878, in the church where they had attended 2 socials, by the minister who had treated Nellie's credentials with respectful skepticism for 6 months, and had come around by August when she saved Arlo Fitch's hands. Widow Pierce was in the front row with the expression of someone attending the conclusion of a logical sequence. Sheriff Holt stood in the back. Silas Webb and his wife came. Dora and Arlo Fitch came, Arlo's hands wrapped but present. 3 of the families Nellie had treated most regularly came. A dozen people from the ranching community who had come to associate Marcus with reliability, and Nellie with competence, and both of them with the kind of steady presence a town depended on. Nellie wore her best dress, which was a dark green that her father had always said suited her, and she carried a small bunch of late-season flowers that Widow Pierce had assembled from the last of her garden. She walked down the aisle herself, which raised a few eyebrows and which she had decided on with deliberate purpose, because she was not being given to anyone. She was arriving. Marcus stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that he had bought for the occasion and which fit him well, and when she walked in, he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, not shock at her beauty, though he found her beautiful, but something deeper and more specific, the look of a man seeing clearly and fully exactly the person he had chosen and choosing again in that moment. The minister said the words. Nellie and Marcus said the words. The rings were plain silver bands, chosen together from the jeweler in Wichita during a trip they had taken in early October, and they fitted each other's hands with the simple exactness of things that had been chosen carefully. Afterward, there was food and dancing in the church hall, and Nellie danced because she wanted to, and because Marcus danced with a straightforward competence that suggested he had learned in the way that people from Missouri often did, at the kind of community gatherings where you learned out of social necessity. They danced twice together and then separately, and Nellie danced with Silas Webb and with old Arlo Fitch, careful of his hands, and Marcus danced with Dora Fitch and Widow Pierce, which made the old woman laugh in a way Nellie had not heard before. It was the best evening of the year, and possibly the best evening of her life up to that point. They moved into a house on the edge of the main street, 3 blocks from the livery stable and 4 blocks from Nellie's office, a modest clapboard house with a good kitchen and 2 bedrooms, and a porch that faced west so that the sunsets, which in Kansas were events rather than occurrences, were visible from the front steps. Nellie kept her office as her office, separate and professional. Marcus kept his stable. They came home to each other at the end of the days that the West reliably filled with things that needed doing. The autumn was good. They cooked together on Sunday mornings, or rather Marcus cooked and Nellie made coffee and bread, which she did extremely well, and they sat on the porch in the cooling evenings and watched the grasslands go amber and gold and eventually brown as the season turned. She found a copy of Middlemarch at the freight merchant's, which had arrived by mistake in someone's book order, and which she read in the evenings and pressed on Marcus when she finished it. And he read it over 3 weeks and told her that the thing about Dorothea was that she needed the right place more than the right person. And Nellie said that she thought it was both. And they spent an entire Sunday evening talking about it, which was exactly the kind of evening she had not known she needed until she had it. He taught her what he knew about horses in the way she had taught him about the basics of wound care, not as instruction, but as exchange. The two of them standing in the stable in the autumn light, while he showed her what to look for in a horse's gait or how to tell the difference between fear and pain in an animal's eye. She found it fascinating in the way she found most things fascinating, with the particular attention of someone who understood that every discipline was a language, and that learning languages expanded the world. She taught a small class for the women of Caldwell on the basics of medical care for children, things that could save a life before a physician arrived, how to manage a high fever, how to treat a wound before infection set in, when something was serious enough to need more than home care. A dozen women came to the first session. 20 came to the second. By the third, she had to move from Widow Pierce's parlor to the church hall. When Widow Pierce said the classes were remarkable, Nellie said it was simply useful information that people should have. Widow Pierce said that useful information, provided freely to women, was more remarkable than most people acknowledged. Nellie thought about this and decided Widow Pierce was right, as the old woman usually was. In November, Nellie discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for several days, examining it from all angles the way she examined everything, because she understood better than most people exactly what it meant biologically, what it would require of her body, and what the practical implications were for her practice. She was not alarmed, though she respected the seriousness of it. She was, when she had examined it sufficiently, quietly glad. She told Marcus on a Thursday evening, directly, sitting across the kitchen table from him while the lamp burned between them. "I am expecting a child," she said, "in late spring, I believe." He sat very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man absorbing something large, and then his face changed in the way faces changed when something hoped for became real. He reached across the table and took her hands and said, "Are you well?" first, which was entirely characteristic and which she loved him for. "I am well," she said. "I intend to practice until the last reasonable moment and to return to practice as soon as is practical. I want you to know that at the outset." "I know that," he said. "I am also, since we are speaking plainly, rather glad," she said. "I am very glad," he said, and the warmth in his voice was the kind that did not need emphasis to be felt. He held her hands on the table, and the lamp flickered gently, and the house around them was warm and solid and theirs. The winter was hard, as Kansas winters were, but Caldwell was a town with enough established community to manage it cooperatively, which Nellie had observed with interest. People checked on each other in ways that the city had never required, because in the city you could buy your way through most difficulties. But out here the currency was often shared labor and attention. She kept her practice through the winter, adding a small second lamp to the office for the shorter days, treating the particular ailments of cold months, frostbite, respiratory infections, the injuries that came from doing dangerous work in difficult conditions. Her pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she monitored with the professional's eye and the expectant mother's hope, and found satisfying evidence each week that both were justified. She taught Dora Fitch, who had become a genuine friend over the months since Arlo's recovery, enough midwifery to assist at a birth, which turned out to be useful in February when a ranching wife delivered 10 days early during a snowstorm that made the roads impassable. Nellie went out on horseback in the snow, which Marcus had argued against on the grounds of common sense, and which Nellie had acknowledged was risky, while pointing out that someone going out was less risky than no one going out, and he had saddled George for her himself, which was how she knew he understood that some arguments were not really arguments about who was right, but about making sure the person you loved knew you were aware of the risk they were taking. The birth was successful. Nellie came home cold and tired and deeply satisfied, and Marcus had kept the fire and the stove going, and there was hot soup and warm water for washing, and she sat by the fire and ate the soup and leaned against his shoulder, and thought that this was the life she had wanted, in the form she had needed, and that it was considerably better than she had known how to ask for when she had been young enough to ask for things. Their son was born in late May of 1879, delivered by Nellie herself with Marcus present and Dora Fitch assisting, in the bedroom of their house on the main street, while the Kansas spring was doing everything it did in May, which was mostly be extravagantly alive outside the windows. The labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was done and the boy was breathing and strong and Marcus was holding him with the expression of a man who had just discovered something entirely new about the scale of the world, Nellie lay back against the pillows and looked at the two of them and felt the very specific and enormous satisfaction of someone who has done something important. "He looks like you," Marcus said. "He does not," she said. "He looks like an infant who is deciding whether to be annoyed at the proceedings." Marcus laughed, full and quiet, and the baby blinked at the sound of it. They named him James for no particular dramatic reason except that they both liked it, and it suited him, as names sometimes immediately and mysteriously do. The summer of 1879 was busy in ways that felt right. James was a healthy, demanding, entirely absorbing presence, and Nellie managed the combination of new motherhood and active medical practice with the organizational competence she brought to everything, establishing a routine that allowed her to return to practice at 6 weeks postpartum, with James in a basket in the back room of the office for the hours she worked, which scandalized exactly the people she expected it to scandalize, and which her actual patients received with the equanimity of people who understood that needs did not pause for propriety. Dora Fitch turned out to be a natural assistant, and by the end of summer was serving as something closer to a medical apprentice, learning with the same steady interest that Nellie recognized from her own early education. She encouraged this without hesitation, because the shortage of medical care in Western territories was primarily a shortage of trained people, and every person who learned to do more was a multiplier of the good that could be done. Marcus expanded the livery stable in the summer, taking on a second man and adding space for the increased traffic that the cattle drives and the growing town required. He was good at the business of it, not just the physical work but the management of it, the relationships with the people who depended on what he offered, the kind of quiet reliability that meant people came back year after year. He came home in the evenings smelling of horses and hay and contentment, which Nellie had come to find among the most comfortable things she knew. They had their disagreements, because they were both people with strong opinions and the habit of saying what they thought. The most sustained one was about whether Nellie should accept the county's offer to formalize her role as the designated county physician, with a modest retainer that would require her to travel to 3 neighboring communities at regular intervals. Marcus's concern was not about her competence or her right to accept. It was about the practicality of traveling with a nursing infant in Kansas weather, and it was a reasonable concern that she had also been examining. They talked about it for several evenings, not fighting but working through it with the genuine negotiating spirit of two people who trusted each other's reasoning even when they reached different preliminary conclusions. The solution they arrived at was that she would accept the county role with the modification that winter travel would be reduced, and that as James grew, the arrangement would become more practical. The county was willing, because a good physician with conditions was considerably better than no physician. She told Marcus the conclusion in the kitchen on a September morning, and he listened and nodded and said, "That works," which was his highest form of endorsement and which she had learned to read accurately. "You are not going to tell me you were right about the winter concerns," she said. "The winter concerns are addressed in the agreement," he said. "That is what matters." She looked at him, her husband of almost a year, sitting at their kitchen table with his coffee and the simple competence of a man who had no interest in being right when being solved was available. "I love you," she said, which she said when she meant it and which therefore meant considerably more for its selectivity. He looked up at her with those steady brown eyes. "I love you too, Nellie," he said, as simply and completely as he said everything. James took his first steps at 12 months, fell down, looked annoyed, and tried again immediately, which Nellie found thoroughly characteristic. He had his father's eyes and her hair, which had darkened slightly from the vivid red of infancy to a warm auburn that caught the light extravagantly. He was a serious, curious child who listened with great attention to anything spoken near him, which Marcus called attentiveness and Nellie called evidence, since she had always believed the best observers started observing before they could speak. The autumn of 1880 brought a new development in Caldwell's political situation. There was talk of incorporation, of formal town government beyond the sheriff's office, of a mayor and a council, and several of the significant men in town were organizing themselves around this idea. Garfield Potts was among them, which was inevitable, and his presence in these conversations meant that any formal structure that emerged would bear watching. But Silas Webb was also involved, and Webb had proven himself a man of practical good sense, and when he came to Nellie and asked whether she would consider a position on the planned town health committee, she considered it seriously. She talked to Marcus about it, who said it sounded like a useful way to have formal standing in decisions that affected her work, and that the health committee would also give her standing that Potts would find harder to undermine than an individual practice. This was practical and correct. She accepted. The first meeting of the Caldwell Town Health Committee was in December of 1880, and Nellie sat at the table as its medical representative with the same composed certainty she brought to her office, and she made the case for a dedicated medical fund in the town budget, a small reserve for patients who genuinely could not pay, a matter she had been managing out of her own resources for 2 years and which was, in principle, a community responsibility. Potts objected to the cost. Webb supported it. 3 other men on the committee looked between the two of them and then at Nellie, and she made the argument clearly and without heat, presenting it as the practical investment in community welfare that it was. The committee voted in favor, 4-1. She walked home in the December cold with the particular warmth of something structural being built, something that would outlast her own personal presence in any given situation. And she found Marcus on the porch smoking the pipe he had once a week when the day had gone well, and she told him, and he said, "Good." And they went inside to where James was already asleep in his room, and the fire was going, and the house was warm and entirely what they had built of it. The winter of 1881 brought another pregnancy, which Nellie diagnosed early and approached with the same pragmatic joy she had brought to the first, and which proceeded with the same gratifying lack of complication. She told her patients she would need to arrange coverage for several weeks around the birth, and made those arrangements with Dora Fitch, who by this point was genuinely capable of handling straightforward cases and knew, clearly and without illusion, exactly what required Nellie's level of skill. Marcus took to the second pregnancy with a warm attentiveness that somehow managed to be entirely without hovering, which was, she had concluded, a specific and underrated gift. He cooked more in the evenings, which he always did well. He walked with her on Sunday evenings, a tradition they had kept from before the wedding, and he listened to her thoughts about the expanding practice and the county role, and the things she wanted to do in the next 5 years, with the same complete and genuine attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed and trusted about him. She delivered their daughter in July of 1881, in the same bedroom, with Dora Fitch assisting and James sleeping in the next room. And when the girl arrived and announced herself with the confident noise of someone who had opinions, Nellie held her and looked at Marcus holding her hand across the bed and felt the fullness of this life she had built. They named her Clara for no particular person, just because it was clear and honest and suited her. James, at 2, was introduced to his sister with the gravity of a very small person being given important information, and said, after a long and serious examination, "Small," which was accurate, and which made both of his parents laugh. The years in Caldwell settled into the kind of life that does not make dramatic stories, but makes the quieter and more durable thing, which is a life genuinely inhabited. Nellie's practice grew in reputation, until people came from settlements 2 and 3 hours away when they had serious needs, and she trained 2 more women in the basics of medical assistance, and wrote to the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania with a detailed account of what could be accomplished in a Western practice by a woman with proper training, because she thought the account might be useful to someone making decisions about their own direction. Marcus expanded the livery stable into a small freight operation, which was not something he had planned but which followed naturally from having reliable horses and a reputation for honesty in his dealings, and which gave them comfortable financial standing in a territory where comfortable financial standing was neither guaranteed nor trivial. He was respected in Caldwell, which was something he wore without making anything of it, the way he wore everything, practically and without performance. The children grew. James at 5 was serious and watchful and preferred the stable to most other places, following his father with the careful attention of a child absorbing everything. He learned to name a horse's gaits at 4 and to identify infection in a simple wound at 5, because he spent time in both his parents' domains and both of them showed him what they knew without making a pedagogy of it. Clara at 3 was different, louder and more immediately social, with the quality of someone who had been born understanding that people were interesting and wanting to know all of them. She brought rocks and flowers and pieces of interesting wood to her mother's office and arranged them in the windowsill as though she were curating a collection of significant items, and Nellie left them there. In the spring of 1883, Nellie was asked by the county to testify before a commission looking at medical practices in Kansas Territory, the first formal effort to establish licensure standards that acknowledged women physicians. She traveled to Topeka with Marcus, leaving the children with Widow Pierce, who at 67 was still formidably competent, and who treated the assignment with the gravity of a field commander accepting an important mission. She testified for 40 minutes before the commission, presenting her 5 years of practice in Caldwell as evidence that women physicians could not only match the care provided by male physicians, but that their presence in Western communities was addressing needs that went otherwise unmet, and that any licensing standard that excluded them by policy rather than qualification was not a medical standard but a social one, and that the two things were different. It was not the first time she had made this argument or some version of it. She had been making it in one form or another since she was 22 years old in Philadelphia. She made it now with the particular authority of someone who had 5 years of actual cases and outcomes to reference, and who had saved Arlo Fitch's hands and Clara Bowen's lungs and Thomas with the broken arm from the hay loft and 260-some other people she could name. The commission did not move as fast as she would have liked, but it moved. 2 of the 5 commissioners asked her follow-up questions that suggested they had found her testimony compelling. She left Topeka with the practical knowledge that nothing immediate had changed, and the longer knowledge that things like this moved in increments, and that she had added her increment. Marcus had been in the hearing room. When she came out, he said, "That was well done," and she said, "It was the truth presented clearly," and he said, "Sometimes that is the hardest thing to do," and they had dinner together in Topeka at a restaurant considerably better than anything in Caldwell and walked along the river in the spring evening talking about nothing in particular, which was the form that happiness took, she had discovered when it was fully established. They came home to Caldwell on a Wednesday, and James met them at the door of Widow Pierce's house with the news that he had named the largest horse in the stable Chester, and Clara was asleep in Widow Pierce's best armchair with a cracker in each hand, and Widow Pierce was drinking tea with the satisfied expression of someone who had conducted operations successfully. Nellie reclaimed her children and walked them home in the warm spring evening with Marcus on her left and James on her right and Clara on her hip, and Caldwell was around them, the town she had arrived in with a broken wheel and a loaded shotgun, and absolutely no intention of asking anyone for help, the town that had become, without her having planned it, exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not come looking for a hero. She had known that clearly and entirely from the beginning. She had come looking for a place to do her work and a life that was fully hers, and she had found them, and she had found Marcus Donnelly in the middle of it, which she had not been looking for and which was, in the end, the best argument she knew for the kind of life that stayed open to the unexpected without being driven by it. He had told her, that first July evening in the long grass, that he had not been looking to be anyone's hero. She had known he meant it in the specific and important way, that he was not offering rescue, not positioning himself as the thing she needed, just placing himself beside her as someone who found her interesting and worth knowing and wanted to be near. That was what he had been, from the beginning to this warm spring evening in 1883 when they walked through Caldwell together. Not a hero, not a savior, just a man who showed up consistently and honestly and let her be exactly what she was, which was, as it turned out, everything. The following years took their shape from the ones that came before, each one an addition to the life they had built rather than a departure from it. James became, by 14, someone who spent as much time in his mother's medical notes as in the stable, and Nellie began to think, with the careful pleasure of someone who had been well taught by her own father, that she might have a student in the house, if that was what he chose. Clara at 12 was incorrigible and warm, and had organized 3 other girls in her school class into a group that met weekly to discuss things they were curious about, which Nellie considered possibly the most encouraging thing she had heard in some time. Nellie's practice was, by 1885, one of the most established in western Kansas, and she had written 2 papers that the Women's Medical College had published in their journal, and which had been cited by 3 other physicians she had never met, which she had found both gratifying and slightly surreal. The county medical fund was still operating. Dora Fitch had trained 2 other women in the years since she had started learning. The first medical licensure standards that acknowledged women physicians explicitly passed in Kansas in 1887, and Nellie received one of the first formal certificates under the new rules, not because she had been waiting for the certificate to practice, but because the certificate was a door she had helped push open and she wanted to stand in it. Marcus was there when she opened the envelope from the state licensing board on a January morning in 1887, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when she looked up from the certificate and at him, he said, "Show me," and she handed it to him, and he read it carefully, all of it, and then he looked at her with the full, direct warmth of someone who had seen what it had taken to get from here to there, and who understood the weight of what was in his hands. "Nellie Yates Donnelly," he read from the certificate. "That is the name," she said. "It is a good name," he said, setting the certificate down on the table with care. "It is my name," she said, which was the thing she meant most precisely. He reached across the table and took her hand, and outside the January window, Caldwell was conducting its ordinary Tuesday morning. And inside the house, James was getting ready for school, and Clara was looking for her other boot, and the fire was burning well, and the coffee was hot, and the life they had built together was entirely and completely alive around them, all the way to its edges, all the way in. She looked at Marcus Donnelly, her husband of 9 years, a man who had never tried to carry her world and who had been unfailingly present to share the weight of it, and she thought that this was the shape of the thing she had always wanted without knowing how to ask for it, this partnership of two people who were entirely themselves and entirely together at the same time. Not a hero, not a rescue, just this, just him, just them, which she had learned was the whole of it.